Hello, this is Mark Galliotti of Mayak Intelligence, University College London, and the In Moscow Shadow podcast. Navalny is dead. Now, truly, if I'd been truly committed to building my brand and so forth, I would have got out an instant response yesterday. But frankly, it was too fresh, too raw. Honestly, it still is. This is not going to be some kind of detailed, dispassionate analysis. There will be time for that, but not yet. This is still more like therapy, I think, than analysis, because, yes, I'm deeply, deeply saddened by it, and not just for Navalny, but for what it says about Russia, and also, frankly, angry. Angry at, obviously, Vladimir Putin and his whole bloody state. And in particular, look, this really does represent another step in this transition from the kind of, I wouldn't say benign, but slightly less malign hybrid authoritarianism that early Putin, did practice, which was more about control of the narrative than having people killed. It wasn't just simply about brutal, thuggish despotism. But that's really where we're headed. And look, some people inevitably are going to draw the parallel with Stalinism. This is not Stalinism, and not just because we're talking about individuals dying rather than thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, but more generally because this is a regime that lacks the murderously grandiose ambitions of the Stalinist state. No, this is banana republic Putinism. This is petty, shallow, small-souled, small-minded, self-aggrandizing, individual thuggishness. Again, I think this is it. We have to acknowledge just how small, and I'll come back to that actually thinking about it, how small in many ways the ambitions of Putin and his circle are. Enrichment, survival, and that's it. Of course, yes, clearly Putin was behind this. Not necessarily that he actually gave a specific order, because although some people have said, oh, well, clearly this is designed to be a signal to the participants at the Munich Security Conference, which is going on at the moment, which strikes me as ridiculous. The Munich Security Conference is largely a collection of the great, the good, and the self-aggrandizing, but I really don't think it features that strongly in Russian calculations. In fact, timing-wise, this is actually very bad timing. Firstly, it's in the lead-up to the elections. And again, whether or not there's going to be any kind of major protest, we'll have to see later today in particular. There's been brave Russians going out to memorials yesterday. But nonetheless, I think there seems to be more or less an attempt to get at 5 o'clock today. This is Saturday the 17th of February. Some kind of wider, nationwide memorialising of Navalny. So we'll have to wait and see about that. But the main thing is, look, they clearly wanted these to be quiet elections. They didn't want sound and fury. The very fact of the array of pygmies against whom Putin will be standing, though not debating, demonstrates that. I think this was meant to be a kind of quiet, there is no alternative, this is just a civic duty, go cast your vote for Putin, but don't pay too much attention to the elections type thing. This has the potential, at least, to stir things up more. More specifically, though, in the United States, the massive aid bill that is currently still being sort of held up in Congress, well, this can't help but run the risk of actually pushing more Republicans who had been opposing it, not so much because they wanted to support Putin at all, but rather, for all kinds of domestic political reasons. It may well feel that they can't really play those games anymore and therefore have to vote it through. So actually, timing-wise, this is not a good time. But on the other hand, clearly Putin is responsible because there has been a policy of, I was going to call it more malign neglect, but it's not even that. It's more, deliberate long-term attempts to sort of sabotage Navalny's health. I mean, this is a man who, after all, in 2020, suffered a near-fatal Novichok nerve agent attack and has been sent not just to a prison colony, but specifically now a so-called special regime, in other words, even tougher colony in the Arctic. And further than that, he clearly had been victim of all sorts of often individually petty, but cumulatively clearly impactful persecutions and such like, being sent to solitary, being kept sort of artificially cold, all that kind of thing, which bit by bit carries a toll. And so, look, it could have happened last month. It could have happened next year. But I think the fact of the matter was, clearly there was an expectation that Navalny quite possibly would not survive his prison term. That is still murder when you actually approach it in those terms. So obviously I'm angry at Putin. And I'm also angry at Putin precisely because what this means for what is for me the most crucial political battle going on in Russia. And you might think, well, what scope is there of a political battle? People aren't able to go out on the streets and campaign. There isn't any kind of real opposition candidacy at the presidential elections, and so forth and so forth. The real battle in Russia, and the one in which actually Navalny was still, even behind razor wire, in the Arctic Circle, significant, was the battle for hope. Look, this is absolutely crucial. Authoritarian regimes, yes, they rely on fear and coercion. They rely on specific co-optation, in other words, finding individuals and groups and giving them reasons to be satisfied with the regime. But they also rely on their capacity to legitimise themselves by delegitimizing the prospect of anything else. In other words, by making people think that there can be no alternative, that things could not get better. Things could only get worse, if at all. But essentially, there's no point. There's no point in taking risks. There's no point in trying to mobilise and organise, because there is no hope. Just survive. Just keep your head down. Maybe, do something for your family today or whatever. But in the big scheme of things, when it comes to Russia, no, things can't get better. And Navalny stood, especially while he was campaigning, but even afterwards, as a particularly powerful symbol of the continuation of that hope. Putin, after all, can't offer that. What does Putin offer? What can Putin offer? Look, originally, he offered a very technocratic kind of legitimation. Basically said this: you stay out of politics, Russians. You let us steal to our heart's content, but there will be enough left over for the rest of you. Your life will get better. Your kids' lives will be better than yours. You'll have a fridge, freezer and stuff in it. You'll have a nicer car. You'll have an iPhone. Whatever. Basically, the Russian people were bought off. They were offered trinkets instead of hope. And look, trinkets makes it sound as if I'm disparaging them. I'm not. In the circumstances, what have they been through? Collapse of the Soviet Union, the anarchic and, for most people, thoroughly immiserated 1990s. In that context, stability and prosperity, that sounds good. Frankly, that's what most people want. We support democracy in the West, not necessarily out of some kind of philosophical commitment to the idea, but because we found that democracy is about the best way we've found to ensure an equitable arrangement of resources, that everyone feels they have something to look forward to, they have some kind of prospect of both security and stability, but also prosperity. That's really what democracy is in practice for most people. So Putin was in a way saying that you can have this without democracy. But of course now people can't have that. So what has he got to offer? I mean, yes, there's the increasingly threadbare sort of cloak of the great patriotic war that he tries to wrap around himself and his regime, trying to create this sense of this sort of grand civilizational struggle with the West. That clearly is not something that most Russians buy. And go back to this point about smallness. I was thinking about one particular moment in the now infamous Tucker Carlson interview. Now, Tucker Carlson is basically providing Putin with a custom-built platform to spread his talking points to the West, to make his giant, to make his case for why America shouldn't be supporting Ukraine, etc., etc. It's a gift. And yet, even with the man presenting you with a gift, at one point Putin has to have that spiteful little jab, the sort of thing he loves to do just to remain in power. So, he makes the point about, oh yes, the CIA, the organisation that you, when you were young, applied to and failed to get into. Again, it's that sense of, I know something about you, and just simply the enjoyment of that. It links to a point that we touch on in Anna Arutunyan and my book that's coming out in June. You see, little bit of product placement there. Downfall, a biography of Yevgeny Prigozhin, the entrepreneur turned troll master turned mercenary commander, who again, has built a career around being servile to Putin, doing whatever Putin needs. And yet, even so, at one point there in palace in St. Petersburg, where Prigozhin is overseeing the catering, and Putin walks past, and he can't help himself. He can't help it. He basically says to Prigozhin, "Oh, nice haircut," or "nice hairstyle, Zhenya." And just in case the point was not fully taken on board, he actually feels the need to point to Prigozhin's bald head. Just, in passing, let me demonstrate that I can do this just by disparaging an otherwise powerful and fearsome individual, and then move on. How small do you have to be? How pitifully small to gain your satisfaction when you are the not just the president, but in some ways the unchallenged despot of a country that stretches halfway around the world, but still to find pleasure and sustenance in these kind of petty personal jabs against people you know full well can do nothing about it. In this respect, I don't think Putin could possibly be the avatar of Russia who can offer any kind of real hope. What he has to offer is exactly the absence of hope. And this is where Navalny's strength when he was alive was. The fact that even in prison conditions he could send back tweets through his lawyer which were basically almost jovial. He was presenting himself as the Ded Moroz, the grandfather Frost, or in other words, the Father Christmas in his Arctic, prison camp. All sorts of other things. This was a man who had a vision of what he called the beautiful Russia of the future. And quite what that beautiful Russia was, we don't know. It was democracy, it was political pluralism. It was also freedom from the institutionalized industrial scale corruption, which is at the heart of the Putin regime. Other details, well, they will be fleshed out. They didn't matter. Once one had rule of law, democracy and the like, things would happen. Now, in the best will in the world, it's hard to imagine that happening in, say, more than less than two political generations. But still, he had that vision and he was able to convey that. And he was able to convey that across the usual kind of class, caste and ideological divides. Even people who were more on the nationalist wing often had some time for Navalny because he was regarded as a patriot. Particularly his return to Russia after being poisoned. That was an astonishing gesture, not just of bravery, but also of patriotism, a commitment to the country. He wasn't another one of those expat political leaders who got the hell out of the country and from a comfortable berth in the West, a think tank or whatever, encouraged Russians to go and put themselves on the line to fight this brutal regime. No, he demonstrated his real skin in the game there. So, in that case, we have to say, has hope died with Navalny? And the answer is, look, I don't know. We're going to have to wait and see. Will he become almost a sort of Che Guevara figure who arguably, after his death, has even more traction on a wider sort of global audience than when he was alive? I'm not saying that Navalny is going to become a global icon in that respect, but certainly the prospect of him being a symbol of what's wrong with the system and why Russians need to struggle and why Russians can still hope, that is still, frankly, we'll have to wait and see. I clearly hope that hope can survive in these circumstances. And I think that we shouldn't underestimate the Russians' capacity to nurture hope even in the darkest of times. And this brings me on to the kind of final point. Remember, this is. Please do not regard this as the last word on the Navalny killing. As I say, this is just a chance for me to kind of vent about things that matter to me. My angers about people who are saying this was Russia's last chance. Or if Russians don't come out on the streets and protest, it proves that they were not worthy of Navalny, or that they are sheep-like in their devotion because they love a strong macho leader and they appreciate that Putin can reach out and kill his enemies. All that kind of thing. Especially, to be perfectly honest, when it comes from Russians who have safely got out of Russia. It's a lot easier to criticise your countrymen when it's frankly a choice between a latte or a cappuccino you face, rather than a prison camp or a beating in the back of a police van. And in that context, I mean, I think generally, well, first of all, and clearly there's enough angers to go round here, I would say that if you really want to criticise the Russians for not going out and protesting against this awful regime, well, if you want to do that, get on a plane, go to Moscow and unfurl a banner criticising Putin. Earn yourself the right to be able to critique others for not putting themselves, and by extension their families, in harm's way. You know, we have to recognise the realities of the situation. And just because there have been times when an angry and an aggrieved populace has risen up, whether we're talking about Euromaidan, or whether we're talking about Arab Spring, or the Iranian Revolution, or whatever else. But just because there have been cases, we shouldn't forget the fact that, in the main, actually, when people just simply try to, especially without some kind of organisation, pit themselves against a brutal authoritarian regime, which is still relatively unified, they lose, and they lose bloodily. Ask the protesters of Tiananmen Square. So, you know, let's avoid some of the hyperbole and, frankly, the victim blaming that looks at Russians as if they have a choice between, frankly, being martyrs or collaborators. But more broadly, well, there I was, just about to go to my last concluding point. More broadly, when suddenly, for whatever reason, the system terminated, I blame the FSB. Hopefully I will be able to stitch these two parts of the video together, but if not, this will appear as an additional little slightly strange coda to my previous one about the death of Navalny. But anyway, what I was going to say is, more broadly, this actually also raises the question of quite what, if anything, the West can do. There's obviously a lot of immediate bloviating, people who will essentially be using this as a chance to score easy, cheap political points by sort of presenting themselves as being sort of at the forefront of the morning while doing nothing about it. And also by people who, as my earlier little rantet suggested, will frankly want to use it as an opportunity just to sort of browbeat the wider Russian population. But let's try and think more constructively. There isn't really the room for, or any great value in, additional sanctions or the like. I mean, what really can we meaningfully do that we haven't already been doing because of the war in Ukraine? And if there are sanctions, I don't know, against more prison service officers or prison medical officers or something, it will really be just to make certain Western politicians feel good about themselves and feel that they're doing something rather than actually anything that's going to have any real impact. Now, what I think we have to recognise, beyond just simply the usual initial point about, first do no harm, the more we identify Russians inside Russia or movements as being ones that we want publicly to support, the more we are actually putting crosshairs on their back in the current environment. So we've got to recognise that. But just generally speaking, we can use this as an opportunity. In the Cold War, we got very, very good in using political warfare against the Soviets. And in particular, we learned one key lesson, which is actually that truth works a lot better than propaganda when you're going against a lying state. A state where mendacity is not just an instrument to be deployed from time to time, but fundamental to its relationship with its own population. If one looks at the importance, for example, of the BBC World Service, the Russian language service, and other language services, their strength and the reason why Soviet citizens would crowd of an evening around a shortwave radio to listen to this voice from the other side of the Iron Curtain was precisely because they were able to trust that it was providing them with news rather than propaganda. One can look at the American Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty stations, which set up initially as, frankly, CIA proxies, and which, in my opinion, certainly started actually as propaganda channels rather than anything else. But they too came to appreciate the importance of actually shifting away from that, ending ties with the CIA, or at least direct ties, and moving towards spreading news rather than a rival set of lies. This is one of my complaints I have with some of the Western so-called sort of fact-checking and anti-disinformation organisations and structures. I can't help feel that they're just simply trying to deploy one set of propagandistic narratives to fight another. But that's another issue. So, I mean, I think that what we do need to do is do our bit insofar as we can, and recognising that ultimately this is a Russian campaign. Russians are going to have to be the ones who bring down this regime or who reshape its replacement. But doing our bit precisely to keep Navalny's name and his message alive. And I think we need to be a lot sharper in actually how we reach out to ordinary Russians. And obviously in this day and age, it's not so much going to be with shortwave radios, it's going to be on the internet. Recognising that the Russian state is doing everything it can to stop that. We might be wanting to look at, for example, how we make access to VPNs, the way in which people can, in some ways, kind of pretend on the internet to be somewhere else than they really are, and access services that the state tries to block. But, we might want to find further ways of making that easier and more accessible to ordinary Russians, and using that access to continue to basically do Navalny's good work. We can be supporting the messages that are put out by his remaining network, which is now largely, obviously, in the West, but is still doing, very interesting investigative work about the corruption of the Russian elite. It's one of the things that gave Navalny his traction, was that he provided these nicely framed, often quite funny, exposés of the corruptions and the self-indulgences of the elite. And that's something that is really important in delegitimizing the regime. But more than just simply, again, using that kind of weapon, is actually just keeping Navalny's message alive. And that means believing in Russians, which may well be hard in these dark times. And there are some people, particularly ones who are, obviously particularly engaged by the horrific war in Ukraine, who are essentially regarded as somehow betraying Ukraine to have any hope for Russia. But I would say that's a mistake. I would say that when we come down to it, ultimately Ukraine's long-term security depends on there being a stable, secure, comfortable Russia that accepts Ukraine's right to exist as an entirely sovereign nation able to determine its own future. And that's the kind of Russia for which Navalny stood. And although, obviously, for Ukrainians, the struggle at the moment is simply to dislodge the Russian invaders on their soil, if we're talking about security rather than just simply victory on the battlefield, that depends on change in Russia. And that depends on hope. So I think actually it is in everyone's interests to keep Navalny's image alive. And I don't just simply mean his face, though by all means, there's scope for a campaign of Navalny graphics being put on walls all across the Russian Federation. But more to the point, the idea that Russians themselves have within them the seeds of a positive future. The more that the West itself also gives up on Russia, the more that the people sort of succumb to this notion that Russia is some kind of irredeemable Mordor, that it actually is unable to reform. It is unable to be anything other than an imperialist authoritarian regime and a threat to its neighbours. Then actually the more they're also playing to Putin's message of a lack of hope. So I have no grand strategy as to how it can be done, especially not today. I'm still pissed off. I'm still mourning, which sounds ridiculous because yes, Russia means a lot to me, but I'm not Russian or whatever. But still, I am mourning. I just realised, you see, I'm wearing black even. But if we want to go beyond that, then while absolutely doing what we can to undermine Putin's regime, to foil its imperialist adventures and so forth, we also have to keep the faith. We also have to have hope that there can be this beautiful Russia of the future. Thank you.